The Yellow Face. The note. In publishing these short sketches based upon the numerous cases in which my companion's singular gifts have made us listeners to, and evidently the actors in, some strange drama, it is only natural that I should dwell rather upon his successes than upon his failures. And this not so much for the sake of his reputation, for indeed, it was when he was at his wit's end that his energy and his versatility were most admirable, but because where he failed it happened too often that no one else succeeded, and that the tale was left forever without a conclusion. Now and again, however, it chanced that even when he erred, the truth was still discovered. I have noted some half-dozen cases of this kind. The adventure of the Musgrave ritual, and that which I am about to recount, are the two which present the strongest features of interest. Sherlock Holmes was a man who seldom took exercise for exercise's sake. Few men were capable of greater muscular effort, and he was undoubtedly one of the finest boxers of his weight that I have ever seen. But he looked upon aimless bodily exertion as a waste of energy, and he seldom bestirred himself where save there was some professional object to be served. Then he was absolutely untiring and infatigable. That he should have kept himself in training under such circumstances is remarkable, but his diet was unusually disparaged, and his habits were simple to the verge of austerity. Some of the occasional use of cocaine had no vices, and he only turned to the drug as a protest against the monotony of existence when cases were scanty and the papers uninteresting. One day in early spring he had so far relaxed as to go for a walk with me in the park, where the first faintest shoots of green were breaking upon the elms, and the sticky spearheads of the chestnuts were just beginning to burst into their fivefold leaves. For 2 hours we rambled about together, in silence for the most part, as befits two men who know each other intimately. It was nearly 5 before we were back at Baker Street once more. "Beg your pardon, sir," said our page boy as we opened the door. "There's been a gentleman here asking for you." Holmes glanced reproach to me. "So much for afternoon walks," said he. "Has this gentleman gone, then?" "Yes, sir." "Didn't you ask him in?" "Yes, sir, he came in." "How long did he wait?" "Half an hour, sir. He was a very restless gentleman, sir. A walking and a stamping all the time he was here. I was waiting outside the door, sir, and I could hear him. At last he got out into the passage, and he cries, 'Is that man never going to come?' Those were his very words, sir. You'll only need to wait a little longer," says I. "Then I'll wait for an and then I'll wait in the open air, for I feel half choked," says he. "I'll be back before long, and without the ups and the outs, and all I could say wouldn't be holding him back." Well, you did your best," said Holmes, as we walked into our room. "It is very annoying, though, Watson. I was badly in need of a case, and thus looks from the man's impatience as if it were to be of importance. Hello, that's not your pipe on the table. He must have left his behind. Nice old briar with a good long stem of what the tobacconists call amber. I wonder how many real amber mouthpieces there are in London. Some people think that a fly in it is a sign. Well, he must have been disturbed in his mind if he left a pipe behind which he evidently highly values." "How do you know that he values it highly?" I asked. "Well, I should put the original cost of the pipe at 7 and 6 pence. Now it has, you see, been twice mended, once in the wooden stem and once in the amber. Each of these mends, done, as you observe, with silver bands. Must have cost more than the pipe did originally. The man must value the pipe highly when he prefers to patch it up rather than to buy a new one with the same money. Anything else? I asked, for Holmes was turning the pipe about in his hand and staring at it in his particular pensive way. He held it up, tapping on it with a long, thin forefinger, as a professor might do when lecturing in a bone. Pipes are occasionally of extraordinary interest, said he. Nothing has more individuality, save perhaps watches and bootlaces. The indications here, however, are neither very marked nor very important. The owner is obviously a muscular man, left-handed, with an excellent set of teeth, careless of its habits, and with no need to practice economy. My friend threw out the information in a very offhand way, but I saw that he cocked his eyes to me to see if I had followed his reasoning. You think a man must be well-to-do if he smokes a 7-shilling pipe, said I. This is a Grosvenor mixture of 8p an ounce, answered Holmes, knocking a little out his palm. As he might get an excellent smoke for half the price, he has no need to practice economy. And the other points? He has been in the habit of lighting his pipe at lamps and gas jets. You can see that it is quite charred all down one side. Of course, a match could have not done so. Why should a man hold a match to the side of his pipe? But you cannot light it at a lamp without getting the bowl charred. And it is not all right. It's all on the right side of the pipe. From that I gather that the man is left-handed. You hold your own pipe to the lamp, and see how naturally you, being right-handed, hold the left side to the flame. You might do it once the other way, but not as a consistency. This has always been held so. Then he has bitten through the amber. It takes a muscular, energetic fellow, and one with a good set of teeth to do that. But if I am not mistaken, I hear him upon the stair. So we shall have something more interesting than his pipe to study. An instant later our door opened, and a tall young man entered the room. He was well but quietly dressed, a dark grey suit, and carried a brown wide-awake in his hand. I should have put him about 30, though he was really some years older. I beg your pardon, he said with some embarrassment. I suppose I should have knocked. Yes, of course I should have knocked. The fact is that I'm a little upset, and you must put it all down to that. He passed his hand over his forehead like a man who is half dazed, and then fell rather than sat upon a chair. I can see that you have not slept for a night or two, said Holmes in his easy, genial way. That tries a man's nerves more than work, and even more than pleasure. May I ask how I can help you? I wanted your advice, sir. I don't know what to do, and my whole life seems to have gone into pieces. You wish to employ me as a consultant detective. Not only that, I want your opinion as a judicious man, as a man of the world. I want to know what I ought to do next. I hope to God that you'll be able to tell me. He spoke in sharp, little jerky outbursts, and it seemed to me that to speak at all was very painful to him, and that his will, although it was overriding his inclinations. It's a very delicate thing, said he. One does not like to speak of one's domestic affairs to strangers. It seems dreadful to discuss the conduct of one's wife with two men whom I have never seen before. It's horrible to have to do it, but I've got to end my tether, and I must have advice. My dear Mr. Grant Monroe, began Holmes. Our visitor sprang from his chair. What? He cried. You know my name? If you wish to preserve your incognito, said Holmes, smiling, I would suggest that you cease to write your name upon the lining of your hat, or else that you turn the crown towards the person whom you are addressing. I was about to say that my friend and I have listened to a good many strange secrets in this room, and that we have had a good fortune to bring peace to many a troubled souls. I trust that you may do so much for you. Might I beg you, as time may prove to be of importance, to furnish me with the facts of your case without further delay? Our visitor again passed his hand over his forehead, as if he found it bitterly hard. From every gesture and expression I could see that he was a reserved, self-contained man, with a dash of pride in his nature, more likely to hide his wounds than to expose them. Then suddenly, with a fierce gesture, he closed his hand, like one who was about to reserve to the winds. He began. "The fact of these, Mr. Holmes," said he, "I am a married man and have been for 3 years. During that time, my wife and I have loved each other as fondly as we lived as happily as any two that were ever joined. We have not had a difference, not once, in thought or word or deed. And now, since last Monday, there suddenly sprung up a barrier between us, and I find that there's something in her life and in her thoughts of which I know as little as if she were a woman who brushes me by the street. We're estranged, and I want to know why. Now, there's one thing I want to impress upon you before I go any further, Mr. Holmes. Effie loves me. Don't let there be any mistake of that. She loves me with her whole heart and soul, and never more than now. I know it. I feel it. I don't want to argue about that. A man can tell easily enough when a woman loves him, but there's this secret between us, and we can never be the same until it's cleared." "Kindly let me know the facts, Mr. Monroe," said Holmes with some impatience. "I'll tell you what I know about Effie's history. She was a widow when I met her first, though quite young, only 25. Her name was then Mrs. Hebron. She went out to America when she was young and lived in the town of Atlanta, where she married this Hebron, who was a lawyer with a good practice. They had one child, but the yellow fever broke out badly in the place, and both husband and child died of it. I've seen his death certificate. This sickened her of America, and she came back to live with her maiden aunt in Pina, in Middlesex. May mentioned that her husband had left her comfortably off, and that she had a capital of about £4,500, which had been well invested by him, but it returned an average of 7%. She had only been 6 months at Pina when I met her. We fell in love with each other, and were married a few weeks afterwards. I'm a hop merchant myself, and I have an income of 700 or 800. We found ourselves comfortably off and took a nice £80 a year villa in Norbury. Our little place was very countrified, considering that it was so close to town. We had an inn and two little houses above us, and a single cottage at the other side of the field that chases us. And except for those, there were no houses until we got halfway up to the station. My business took me into town at certain seasons, but in summer I had less to do, and then in our country home my wife and I were just as happy as we could have wished. I tell you, there was never a shadow between us until this accused affair began. There's one thing I ought to tell you before I go further. When we married, my wife made over a little property to me, rather against my will, for I saw how awkward it would be if my business affairs went wrong. However, she would have it so, and it was done. Well, about 6 weeks ago, she came to me. "Jack," said she, "when you took my money, you said that if I ever wanted it, and wanted any, all I had to do was ask you for it." "Certainly," said I. "It's all your own." "Well," said she, "I want £100." I was a bit staggered by this, but what I'd managed it was simply for a new dress or something of the kind that she was after. What on earth for? I asked. Oh, said she in a playful way. You said that you were only my banker, and bankers never ask questions, you know. If you really mean it, of course you all shall have the money, said I. Ow, get off my leg, cat. And you won't tell me what you want it for? Someday, perhaps, but just not at present, Jack. So I had to be content with that, though it was the first time that there had ever been any secret between us. I gave her a check, and I never thought any more of the matter. It may be nothing to do with what came afterwards, but I thought it was only right to mention it. Well, I told you just now that there was a cottage not far from our house. There's just a field between us, but to reach it you have to go along the road and then turn down a lane. Just beyond it is a very nice little grove of Scotch firs, and I used to be very fond of strolling down there, for the trees are always a neighborly kind of thing. The cottage had been standing empty for 8 months, and it was a pity, for it was a pretty two-storied place with an old-fashioned porch and honeysuckle about it. I stood many a time and thought what a neat little homestead it would make. Well, last Monday evening I was taking a stroll down that way when I met an empty van coming up the lane and saw a pile of carpets and things lying about on a grass plot beside the porch. It was clear that the cottage had at least been let. I walked past, and then stopping was an Indian man. Night. I ran my eye over and wondered what sort of folk they were who had come to live so near us. And as I looked, suddenly became aware that a face was watching me out of one of the upper windows. I don't know what there was about that face, Mr. Holmes, but it seemed to send a chill right down my back. I was a little way off, so that I could not make out the features, but there was something unnatural and unhuman about the face. That was the impression that I had, and I moved quickly forward to get a nearer view of the person who was watching me. But as I did so, the face suddenly disappeared, so suddenly that it seemed to have been plucked away in the darkness by the room. I stood for 5 minutes thinking the business over and trying to analyze my impressions. I could not tell if the face was that of a man or a woman. It had been too far for me to see that, but its color was what had impressed me the most. It was a livid, chalky white, and with something set and rigid about it that was shockingly unnatural. So disturbed was I that I determined to see a little more of the new inmates of the cottage. I approached and knocked at the door, which was instantly opened by a tall, gaunt woman with a harsh, forbidding face. "What may you be wanting?" she asked in a northern accent. "I'm your neighbor over yonders," said I, nodding toward my house. "I see that you have only just moved in, so I thought I could be of any help to you in any way." I just ask you if we want you," she said, and she shut the door in my face. Annoyed at the careless rebuff, I turned my back and walked home. All evening, though I tried to think of other things, my mind would still turn to the apparition at the window and the rudeness of the woman. I determined to say nothing about it to former my wife, for she was a nervous, highly strung woman, and I had no wish that she should share the unpleasant impression which had been produced upon myself. I remarked to her, however, before I fell asleep, that the cottage was now occupied, to which she returned no reply. I'm usually an extremely sound sleeper. It has just been a standing jest in the family that nothing can ever wake me during the night. And yet, somehow on that particular night, whether it may be that the slight excitement produced by my little adventure, I know not, but I slept much more lightly than usual. Half in my dreams I was dimly conscious that something was going on in the room. I gradually became aware that my wife had dressed herself, and was slipping on her mantle and her bonnet. My lips were parted to murmur out some sleepy words of surprise or reconnaissance at this untimely preparation, when suddenly my half-opened eyes fell upon the face, illuminated by a candlelight, and the astonishment held me dumb. She wore an expression such as I had never seen before, such as I should have thought her incapable of assuming. She was deadly pale and breathing fast, glancing furtively towards the bed as she fastened up her mantle to see if she had disturbed me. Then, thinking that I was still asleep, she slipped noiselessly out of the room, and an instant later I heard a sharp creaking, which could only come from the hinges of the front door. I sat up in bed and rapped my knuckles against the rail to make certain that I was only truly awake. Then I took my watch from under the pillow, and it was 3 in the morning. What on earth could my wife be doing on the country road at 3 in the morning? I had sat for about 20 minutes turning the thing over in my mind and trying to find some possible explanation. The more I thought, the more extraordinary and inexplicable it did appear. It was still puzzling over when I heard the door gently close again, and her footsteps coming up the stairs. "Where in the world have you been, Elfie?" I asked as she entered. She gave a violent start and some kind of gasping cry when I spoke, and that cry started troubling me more than all the rest, for there was something indescribably guilty about them. My wife had always been a woman of frank, open nature, and it gave me a chill to see her slinking into her own room and crying out and wincing when her own husband spoke to her. "You're awake, Jack," she cried with a nervous laugh. "Why, I thought that nothing could awake you." "Where have you been?" I asked more sternly. "I don't wonder that you are surprised," said she, and I could see that her fingers were trembling as she undid the fastenings of her mantle. "Why, I never remember having done such a thing in my life before. The fact is that I felt as though I were choking and had a perfectly longing for a breath of fresh air. I really think that I should have fainted if I had not gone out. I stood in the door for a few minutes, and now I am quite myself again." All the same time she was telling me the story, she never once looked in my direction, and her voice was quite unlike her usual tones. It was evident to me that she was saying was false. I said nothing in reply, but turned to face the wall, sick at heart, with my mind filled with 1,000 venomous doubts and suspicions. What was it that my wife was concealing from me? Where had I been during the strange expedition? I felt that I should have no peace until I knew, and yet I shrank from asking her again after once she had told me what was false. All the rest of the night I tossed and tumbled, framing theory after theory, and each more unlikely than the last. I should have gone to the city that day, but I was too disturbed in my mind to be able to pay attention to business matters. My wife seemed to be as upset as myself, and I could see from the little questioning glances which she kept shooting at me that she understood that I disbelieved her statement, and that she was at her wits' end what I was to do. We hardly exchanged a word during breakfast, and immediately afterwards I went out for a walk that I might think the matter out in the fresh morning air. I went as far as the Crystal Palace and spent an hour on the grounds, and was back in Norbury by 1 o'clock. It happened that I took my way past the cottage, and I stopped for an instant to look at the windows to see if I could catch a glimpse of the strange face which had looked at me the day before. As I stood there, I imagined my surprise, Mr. Holmes, when the door suddenly opened and my wife walked out. I was dumbstruck with astonishment at the sight of her, but my emotions were nothing to those which showed themselves upon her face when our eyes met. She seemed for an instant to wish to shrink back inside the house again, and then, seeing how useless all concealment must be, she came forward with a very white face and frightened eyes which belied the smile on her lips. "Ah, Jack," said she, "I must have
I've just been in to see what I can do for any assistance to our neighbors. Why are you looking at me face like that? Are you not angry with me?
So, said I, this is where you went during the night?
What do you mean? She cried.
You came here, I'm sure of it. Who are these people that you should visit them at such an hour?
I have not been here before.
How can you tell me what you know is false? I cried. Your very voice changes as you speak. When have I ever had a secret from you? I shall enter that cottage and I shall probe the matter to the bottom.
No, no, Jack, for God's sake,
she gasped with uncontrollable emotion. Then, as I approached the door, she seized my sleeve and pulled me back with convulsive strength.
I implore you not to do this, Jack, she cried. I swear that I will tell you everything some day, but nothing but misery can come of it if you enter that cottage.
Then, as I tried to shake her off, she clung to me in a frenzy of entreaty.
Trust me, Jack, she cried. Trust me only this once. You will never have to regret it. You know that I would not have a secret from you if it were not for your own sake. Our whole lives are at stake in this. If you came home early with me, all will be well. If you force your way into that cottage, all is over between us.
There was such an earnestness, such despair in her manner, that her words arrested me, and I stood irresolute before the door. I will trust you on one condition, and one condition only, said I at last. It is that this mystery comes to an end from now. You are at liberty to preserve your secret, but you must promise that there shall be no more nightly visits, no more doings which are kept from me, past my knowledge. I am willing to forget those which are past if you promise that there shall be no more in the future.
I was sure that you would trust me, she cried with a great sigh of relief. It shall be just as you wish. Come away, oh, come away up to the house.
Still pulling at my sleeve, she led me away from the cottage, and as we went I glanced back, and there was that yellow, livid face watching out from the upper window. What link could there be between this creature and my wife? Or how could the coarse, rough woman whom I had seen the day before be so connected with her? It was a strange puzzle, and yet I knew that my mind could never know ease again until I had solved it. For 2 days after this I stayed at home, and my wife appeared to abide loyally by our engagement, for as far as I know, she never stirred out of the house. On the 3rd day, however, I had ample evidence that her solemn promise was not enough to hold her back from the secret influence which drew her away from her husband and her duty. I had gone into town that day, but I returned by 2:40 instead of 3:36, which is my usual train. As I entered the house, the maid ran into the hall with a startled face. "Where's your mistress?" I asked.
I think that she has gone out for a walk, she answered.
My mind was instantly filled with suspicion. I rushed upstairs to make sure that she was not in the house. As I did so, I happened to glance out of one of the upper windows and saw the maid, with whom I had just been speaking, running across the field in the direction of the cottage. Then, of course, I saw exactly what it all meant. My wife had gone over there and had asked the servant to call her if I should return. Tangling with anger, I rushed down and hurried across, determined to end the matter once and forever. I saw my wife and the maid hurrying back along the lane, and I did not stop to speak with them. In the cottage lay the secret which were casting a shadow over my life. I vowed that, come what it might, it should be no secret any longer. I did not even knock when I reached it. I turned the handle and rushed into the cottage. It was all still and quiet upon the ground floor. In the kitchen was a kettle singing by the fire. A large black cat lay coiled up in a basket, but there was no sign of the woman whom I had seen before. I ran into the other room, but it was equally deserted. Then I rushed up the stairs only to find 2 other rooms empty and deserted at the top. There was no one at all in the whole house. The furniture and pictures were almost common and vulgar description, save in one chamber at the window of which I saw a strange face. That was comfortable and elegant, and all my suspicions rose into a fierce, bitter flame when I saw that on the mantelpiece stood a copy of a full-length photograph of my wife, which had been taken at my request only 3 months ago. I stayed long enough to make certain that the house was absolutely empty. Then I left it, feeling a weight at my heart such I had never felt before. My wife came into the hall as I entered the house, but I was too hurt and too angry to speak to her, and pushing past her, I made my way into my study. She followed me, however I could close the door.
"I'm sorry that I broke my promise, Jack," she said, "but if you knew all the circumstances, I'm sure you would forgive me."
"Tell me everything, then," said I.
"I cannot, Jack, I cannot," she cried.
"Until you tell me who it is that's been living in that cottage, and who it is whom you've given that photograph, there can never be any confidence between us," said I, and breaking away from her, I left the house. That was yesterday, Mr. Holmes, and I've not seen her since, nor do I know any more than this strange business. It is the first shadow that has come between us, and it has so shaken me that I do not know what I should do for the best. Suddenly this morning it occurred to me that you were the man to advise me, so I have heard to you now, and I place myself unreservedly in your hands. If there is any point which I have not made clear, pray question me about it, but above all, tell me quickly what I am to do, for this misery is more than I can bear. Holmes and I had listened with the utmost interest to this extraordinary statement, which had been delivered in the jerky, broken fashion of a man who is under the influence of extreme emotion. My companion sat silent now for some time, with his chin upon his hand, lost in thought. "Tell me," he said at last, "could you swear that this is a man's face which you saw in the window?" "Each time I saw it I was some distance away from it, so it is impossible for me to say." "You appear, however, to be disagreeably impressed by it." "It seemed to be an unusual color, and to have a strangely rigidity about the features. When I approached it, it vanished with a jerk." "How long has it been since your wife asked you for the £100? "Nearly 2 months now." "Have you ever seen a photograph of her first husband?" "No, there was a great fire in Atlanta shortly after his death, and all her papers were destroyed." "And yet she had a certificate of death. You say that you saw it?" "Yes, she got a duplicate after the fire." "Did you ever meet anyone who knew her in America?" "No." "Did she ever talk about revisiting the place?" "No." "Or get letters from it?" "No." "Thank you. I should like to think over the matter for a little now. If the cottage is now permanently deserted, we may have some difficulty. If, on the other hand, as I fancy is more likely, the inmates were warned of your coming, and left you before you entered yesterday, they may be back now, and we should clear it all up easily. Let me advise you, then, to return to Norbury and to examine the windows of the cottage again. If you have reason to believe that it is inhabited, do not force your way in, but send a wire to my friend and me. We shall be with you within an hour of receiving it, and we shall then very soon get to the bottom of the business." "And if it's still empty?" "In that case, I shall come out tomorrow and talk it over with you. Goodbye, and above all, do not fret until you know that you really have a cause for it." I'm afraid that this is bad business, Watson, said my companion as he returned after accompanying Mr. Grant Burrow to the door. What do you make of it? It had an ugly sound, I answered. Yes, there's blackmail in it, or I am much mistaken. And who's the blackmailer? Well, it must be the creature that lives only in comfortable room in the place, and has her photograph upon his fireplace. Upon my word, Watson, there's something rather attractive about a livid face at the window, and I would not have missed the case for worlds. You have a theory? Yes, a provisional one. But I shall be surprised if it does not turn out to be correct. This woman's first husband is in the cottage. Why do you think that? How else can we explain her frenzied anxiety that her second one should not enter it? The facts, as I read them, are something like this. This woman was married in America. Her husband developed some hateful qualities, or shall we say, he contracted some loathsome disease and became a leper or some imbecile. She flies from him at last, returns to England, changes her name, and starts her life, as she thinks, afresh. She has been married 3 years of her life, well, 3 years, and believes that her position is quite secure, having shown her husband the death certificate of some man whose name she has assumed, when suddenly her whereabouts were discovered by her first husband, or, we may suppose, by an unscrupulous woman who has attached herself to the invalid. They write to the wife and threaten to come to expose her. She asks for £100 and endeavours to buy them off. They come in spite of it, and when the husband mentions casually to the wife that he knows the newcomers in the cottage, she knows in some way that they are her pursuers. She waits until her husband is asleep, and then rushes down to the endeavour to persuade them to leave her in peace. Having no success, she goes again in the morning, and her husband meets her, as he told us, and she comes out. She promises him not to go there again, but 2 days afterwards, in hope of getting rid of the dreadful neighbours, was too strong for her, and she made another attempt, taking down with her the photograph which had probably been demanded of her. In the midst of the interview, the maid rushes in to say that the master had come home, on which the wife, knowing that he would come straight down to the cottage, hurried the inmates out the back door and into the grove of fir trees, probably, which was mentioned as standing near. In this way he found the place deserted. I shall be very much surprised, however, if it is still so when he reconnoitres it in the evening. What do you think of my theory? It is all surmise. But at least it covers all the facts. When new facts come to our knowledge, we cannot be covered by it. It will be time enough to reconsider it. We can do nothing more until we have a message from our friend Norbury. But we had not very long time to wait for that. It came just as we had finished our tea. The cottage is still tenanted, it said, and have seen the face again at the window. We'll meet at 7 o'clock train, and will take no steps until you arrive. He was waiting at the platform when we stepped out, and we could see in the light of the station lamps that he was very pale and quivering with agitation. Still there, Mr. Holmes, he said, laying his hand hard upon my friend's sleeve. I saw lights in the cottage as I came down. We shall settle now once and for all. What is your plan, then? Asked Holmes as he walked down this dark tree-lined road. I'm going to force my way in and see for myself who is in this house. I wish you both to be there as witnesses. You are quite determined to do this in spite of your wife's warning that it is better that you should not solve the mystery? Yes, I'm determined. Well, I think that you are in the right. Any truth is better than an indefinite doubt. We'd better go up to them once, of course, legally. We are putting ourselves hopelessly in the wrong, but I think that it is worth it. It was a very dark night, and a thin rain began to fall as we turned the high road into the narrow lane, deeply rutted with hedges on either side. Mr. Grant Munro pushed impatiently forward, however, and we stumbled after him as best as we could. There are the lights in the house, he murmured, pointing at the glimmer among the trees. And here's the cottage I'm going to enter. We turned a corner into the lane as he spoke, and there was a building close beside us. A yellow bar falling across a black foreground showed that the door was not quite closed, and one window in the upper story was brightly illuminated. As we looked, we saw a dark blur moving across the blind. "There's that creature," cried Grant Munro. "You can see for yourselves that someone is there. Now follow me, and we shall soon know all." We approached the door, but suddenly a woman appeared at the shadow and stood in the golden track of the lamplight. I could not see her face for the darkness, but her arms were thrown out in an attitude of entreaty.
"For God's sake, don't check," she cried. "I had a presentiment that you would come here this evening. Think better of it, dear. Trust me again, and you will never have cause to regret it."
"I've trusted you too long, Effie," he cried sternly. "Let go of me. I must pass you. My friends and I are going to settle this matter once and forever." He pushed her to one side, and we followed closely after him. As he threw the door open, an old woman had run out in front of him and tried to bar his passage, but he thrust her back, and an instant afterwards we were upon the stairs. Grant Munro rushed up the lighted room at the top and entered on his heels. It was a cozy, well-furnished apartment, with 2 candles burning upon a table, and 2 upon the mantelpiece in a corner. Stooping over a desk, there sat what appeared to be a little girl. Her face was turned away as we entered, but we could see that she was dressed in a red frock, and that she had long white gloves on, and she whisked around to us and gave a cry of surprise and horror. The face which was turned towards us was of very strangest livid tint, and the features were absolutely devoid of any expression. An instant later the mystery was explained. Holmes, with a laugh, passed his hand behind the child's ear. A mask peeled off her countenance, and there was a little coal-black negress, with all of her white teeth flashing in amusement at our amazed faces. I burst out laughing, out of sympathy with her merriment, but Grant Munro stood staring, with his hand clutching his throat. "My God!" he cried. "What can be the meaning of all this?"
"I will tell you the meaning of all of this," cried the lady, sweeping into the room with a proud, set face. "You have forced me, against my own judgment, to tell you, and now we must both decide to make the best of it. My husband died in Atlanta, but my child survived."
"Your child?" She drew a very large silver locket from her bosom.
You have never seen this open."
"I understood that it did not open." She touched the spring, and the fronts hinged back. There was a portrait within of a man strikingly handsome and intelligent-looking, but bearing an unmistakable signs upon his features of his African descent.
"That is John Hebron of Atlanta," said the lady, "and a nobler man has never walked the earth. I cut myself off from my race in order to wed him, but never once while he lived did I for an instant regret it. It was our misfortune that our only child look after his people rather than mine. It is often so in such matches, and little Lucy is far than her father was. But dark or fair, she is my own dear little girlie, and her mother's pet."
The creature ran across at the words and nestled up to the lady's dress.
"When I left her in America," she continued, was only because her health was weak, and the change might have done her harm. She was given the care of this faithful Scotchwoman who had once been our servant. Never for an instant did I dream of disowning her as my child. But when the chance threw you in my way, Jack, I learned to love you. I feared to tell you about my child. God forgive me, I feared that I should lose you, and that I would not have the courage to tell you. I had to choose between you, and in my weakness, I turned away from my own little girl. For 3 years I have kept her existence a secret from you. But I heard from the nurse, and I knew that all was well with her. At last, however, there came an overwhelming desire to see the child once more. I struggled against it, but in vain. Though I knew the danger, I determined to have the child brought over, and if it were for but a few weeks, I sent £100 to the nurse, and I gave her the instructions about this cottage, so that she might come as a neighbor, without any preparing to be in any way connected with her. I pushed my precautions so far as to order keep the child in the house during the daytime, and cover her up a little in face and hands, so that even those who might see her at the window might not gossip about seeing a black child in the neighborhood. If I had been less cautious, I might have been more wise, but I was half crazy with fear that you should learn the truth. It was you who told me that first that the cottage was occupied. I should have waited for the morning, but I could not sleep for excitement. And so that night I slipped out, knowing how difficult it was to wake you. But you saw me go, and that was the beginning of our troubles. Next day you had my secret at your mercy, but you nobly refrained from pursuing your advantage. 3 days later, however, the nurse and the child only escaped from the back door just as you rushed in the front one. And now tonight, you at last know all, and I must ask you what is to become of us, my child and me.
She clasped her hands and waited for the answer. It was a long 10 minutes before Grant Monroe broke the silence, and when his answer came, it was one of which I love to think. He lifted the little child, kissed her, and then, still carrying her, held his other hand out to his wife and turned towards the door. We can talk it over more comfortably at home, said he. I'm not a very good man, Effie, but I think that I am a better one than you have given me credit for being. Holmes and I followed them down the lane, and my friend plucked up at my sleeve as we came out. I think, said he, that we shall be of more use in London than in Norbury. Not another word did he say of the case until late that night, when he was turning away with his lighted candle for his bedroom. Watson, he said, if I should ever strike you that I am getting a little overconfident in my powers, or giving less pains to a case than it deserves, kindly whisper Norbury in my ear, and I shall definitely be obliged to you.